You ever notice how every religion claims to have the truth? But somehow all their truths contradict each other. One says there's one God, another says there are many, and a third says there's no God but theirs. And all of them can't be right. Yet every believer is certain theirs is the one that came straight from the divine. That alone should make anyone pause. If a God truly revealed the truth, wouldn't it be consistent? Universal? Why would it depend on where you were born? The fact that your religion is mostly determined by geography, by the country or family you happen to be born into, should tell you a lot. People in India tend to be Hindu. People in Saudi Arabia are mostly Muslim. People in the US are mostly Christian. We treat religion like an inherited identity, not a discovered truth. And that's because religion was shaped by human culture, not by a supernatural being handing out universal wisdom. If religion really came from an all-knowing God, it wouldn't evolve or adapt with society. But that's exactly what we see. Religion constantly reshaping itself to fit new moral standards, new political realities, and new scientific understanding. Slavery used to be justified with scripture. Now believers reinterpret those same verses to say the opposite. The church once opposed women's rights, education, and basic freedoms. Now it claims to have always respected equality. That's not divine truth changing. That's people updating their story to match the times. Human fingerprints are all over religion. Look at how the gods themselves resemble the people who worship them. In ancient Greece, their gods were emotional, jealous, vengeful, just like humans. Norse gods fought and drank and died in battle. The gods of early nomadic tribes were territorial and warlike. And when empires formed, gods became more bureaucratic, moralistic, and obsessed with obedience. Every era projected its own values upward into the sky. Humanity created gods in its own image, not the other way around. Even the earliest forms of religion were about control and comfort. Ancient rulers realized early on that religion was an incredible way to unify people, or to keep them in line. If you could convince people that your authority came from heaven, they'd obey without question. Kings claimed divine right. Priests spoke for the gods. The line between power and holiness blurred completely. Religion wasn't just about explaining the universe. It was a social technology, a tool for stability, loyalty, and order. But the emotional side was just as powerful. Early humans faced a terrifying world. Diseases, storms, death, and no idea why any of it happened. Religion offered meaning when nothing made sense. If a child died, it wasn't random. It was part of God's plan. If a harvest failed, you could sacrifice or pray to fix it next time. That sense of control, even if imaginary, gave comfort. Fear and hope, two of the most powerful human emotions, are what religion was built on, and it worked. Created community, shared purpose, and moral codes before science and law could fill those roles. In many ways, religion was humanity's first attempt at civilization. But the key word is attempt. Like early medicine with leeches and bloodletting, it was our best guess at the time. We were trying to make sense of things with limited knowledge. The problem is, religion never stopped pretending it was the final truth. Even when we outgrew its explanations, it kept claiming divine authority. Take creation myths. Every culture had one, because everyone wanted to know where we came from. But instead of discovering the truth, people invented stories that fit their level of understanding. The Bible's creation story wasn't written by scientists. It was written by desert tribes trying to explain the universe with no concept of atoms, galaxies, or evolution. They imagined a God forming humans from dust, because that was the best metaphor they had. It wasn't revelation. It was imagination. What's fascinating is that every religion makes that same claim. We didn't invent this. God revealed it. But when you compare their texts, the patterns are unmistakable. They recycle older myths, reshape earlier gods, and borrow moral ideas from older civilizations. The flood in the Bible, taken from older Mesopotamian myths. The virgin birth, common in ancient religions long before Christianity. Even moral commandments existed in Hammurabi's code centuries before Moses supposedly climbed a mountain. These stories weren't divine downloads. They were cultural updates. And once you see religion as a human invention, everything starts making more sense. The contradictions, the revisions, the selective morality, all of it reflects human priorities, not divine wisdom. We didn't find truth in the heavens. We built it on the ground, trying to make sense of a confusing world. So the real question isn't whether religion was made by humans. It's why we keep pretending it wasn't. So why do people still believe that religion came from something beyond themselves? Part of it is tradition, sure. But deeper than that, it's about identity. When you grow up hearing that your religion is sacred, eternal, and unquestionable, you stop seeing it as a human system. It becomes part of who you are. You're not just defending ideas. You're defending yourself, your family, your culture. Questioning religion feels like betrayal. And that emotional attachment is exactly what's kept religion alive for thousands of years. The structure of most religions shows how deeply human they are. They all have hierarchy. Priests, imams, rabbis, monks, people who claim special access to the truth. They interpret, control, and define what's allowed. You see the same system in politics, business, even sports. There's always someone at the top, someone with authority, and a group that follows. It's Human Organization 101. A divine being wouldn't need a chain of command, rituals, or sacred uniforms. Those are human inventions, the packaging that makes belief look official. Then there's the language of religion. Sacred texts are filled with metaphors, contradictions, and vague rules open to interpretation. That's not divine perfection. That's exactly how humans write when they're guessing, debating, or trying to sound profound without being specific. If a God wanted to communicate clearly, it wouldn't take thousands of denominations to figure out what love thy neighbor really means. The confusion we see between sects and denominations isn't a sign of divine depth. It's a sign of human inconsistency. Psychologically, humans are drawn to certainty. Our brains hate not knowing. When something terrible happens, the idea that it's part of God's plan feels safer than sometimes life is chaotic and unfair. Religion fills that gap. It replaces uncertainty with story. And because stories are how humans make sense of the world, religion thrives by offering narratives. Creation, sin, redemption, destiny. Each one gives structure to the randomness of life. But that structure isn't evidence of divine truth. It's evidence of how storytelling evolved as a coping mechanism. And those stories are always conveniently centered around humans. The entire universe, we're told, was made for us, even though we're one species on a small planet, orbiting an average star in a vast, indifferent galaxy. That's not cosmic humility. That's human ego. We made ourselves the main characters of the universe because it feels unbearable to think we're not special. Religion took that fear and turned it into doctrine. We created gods who look after us, who love us, who get angry when we disobey, because that's the kind of relationship we understand. You can trace this pattern across history. Early hunter-gatherers worshipped spirits of nature, the sun, the rain, the animals, because those were the forces that shaped their survival. When agriculture appeared, gods became fertility gods, harvest gods, sky gods, the new priorities of settled life. When empires rose, gods became rulers and judges. And when philosophy developed, gods became abstract, omnipotent, omniscient, beyond time. The divine evolved along with our societies, mirroring our progress and our problems. The way religions change over time is one of the clearest clues that they're human creations. No timeless truth needs constant revision. Yet every faith reinterprets its scriptures to stay relevant. You can find modern pastors and imams explaining how ancient texts actually meant something different, because they have to adapt outdated ideas to modern ethics. Verses once used to justify slavery are now downplayed. Passages about women's inferiority are reinterpreted. Whole sections once taken literally are now symbolic. That's not revelation. That's editing. And when religion can't adapt fast enough, it fragments. Every major religion has hundreds of branches that disagree on doctrine, practice, and interpretation. The result? Endless arguments about who's the real believer. If a perfect God delivered one perfect message, how could it splinter into so many conflicting versions? The logical answer is it didn't. People wrote, revised, and fought over these ideas because they came from people, not from anything divine. Even morality, often claimed as religion's domain, predates religion. Cooperation, empathy, fairness, these evolved long before anyone built temples. You can see moral behavior in animals that have never heard of commandments or scriptures. Primates share food, elephants grieve their dead, dolphins help injured companions. Morality isn't revealed. It's biological. Religion didn't invent ethics. It claimed ownership of them. It took our natural social instincts and branded them as divine law. But once religion got tied to morality, it became untouchable. People started thinking, if there's no God, then everything is meaningless. That's the trap. Religion made itself seem indispensable by claiming credit for basic human decency. But goodness doesn't need divine supervision. People don't refrain from murder because of scripture. They do it because empathy and social cooperation keep societies alive. Religion just turned that instinct into law, adding the threat of eternal punishment to make sure no one questioned it. And fear, that's the engine of religion. Fear of death, fear of chaos, fear of meaninglessness. Religion's promise to fix all three. Believe and you'll live forever. Obey and the world will make sense. Worship and your suffering has purpose. It's psychological engineering, perfectly tailored to human vulnerability. And because fear never goes away, the demand for faith never does either. Still, some argue that religion couldn't have survived this long if it wasn't true. But longevity doesn't prove truth, it proves usefulness. Astrology and monarchy survived for centuries too, not because they were true, but because they served a function. Religion provided community, identity, and comfort. That's why it lasted. Not because a god built it, but because humans needed it. That's the thing about human inventions. The best ones meet real needs. Religion met emotional needs, the need for meaning, belonging, and control. It met social needs, the need for cooperation and shared values. And it met political needs, the need to organize power and justify authority. Once you understand those layers, you stop seeing religion as a divine revelation and start seeing it as a brilliant, complex human creation, maybe the most influential one in history. If you look closely, the power structures behind religion reveal just how human the whole thing is. Every organized faith has one thing in common: control. Control over behavior, over thought, over information. From the start, religious authority wasn't about guiding people to truth. It was about guiding people to obedience. And that's why every religion has leaders who act as gatekeepers between you and the divine. The moment you tell people they can't speak directly to God, that they need a priest, a rabbi, an imam, or a monk to do it for them, you create dependency. You create a system where access to truth runs through human hands. Those at the top decide what counts as holy, what counts as sin, and what you must do to be forgiven. It's a perfect loop. The same system that defines your guilt sells you the cure. You can see this throughout history. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church controlled nearly every aspect of life. They claimed to hold the keys to heaven, and that made them more powerful than kings. They sold indulgences, literal payments for forgiveness. They banned translations of the Bible so only clergy could interpret it. It wasn't about protecting faith. It was about protecting authority. A god wouldn't need censorship to be believed. Humans do, and this isn't unique to Christianity. In many Islamic empires, religious scholars held immense political influence, deciding what laws were divine and who had the right to rule. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was a god. His power came from being seen as divine. In Hindu societies, the caste system tied social hierarchy to spiritual purity. In every case, religion wasn't separate from politics. It was politics, just wearing sacred robes. Think about rituals, too. They're not divine by nature, they're social technologies. They create unity, identity, and emotional bonding. Group prayer, chanting, fasting, festivals. All of these are ways to synchronize people's emotions and actions. Psychologists call this collective effervescence, the feeling of being part of something larger than yourself. It's powerful, but it's also deeply human. Even non-religious groups experience it, at concerts, rallies, sports games. The difference is that religion turned that feeling into proof of divinity. Scripture works the same way. Most holy texts weren't written all at once or by a single author. They were compiled, edited, and translated across generations. The Bible, for example, is a patchwork of older stories. written by different people at different times, often centuries apart. The Quran was assembled after the Prophet Muhammad's death, based on oral recitations and memories. The Vedas, too, were passed down orally for hundreds of years before being written. These texts didn't fall from the sky. They were curated by humans, copied by humans, and interpreted by humans, each time with a chance for bias, politics, or error. And when those texts became inconvenient, they were edited or reinterpreted. The Council of Nicaea, for instance, decided which Christian writings were inspired and which were heresy. The Gospel of Thomas, out the Gospel of Mary, out the idea of Jesus as divine, officially in. That wasn't divine revelation. That was a political meeting. Men in robes debating which version of the story would unite the empire. And that's exactly what it did. Religion has always adjusted itself to serve the needs of those in power. When rulers needed obedience, they emphasized punishment and sin. When people needed hope, they emphasized salvation and love. When science challenged old dogma, they rebranded faith as metaphor. The divine message never stayed consistent because it never came from the divine. It came from people with agendas, some sincere, others strategic. Even the symbols of religion reflect human design. Take the cross, the crescent, the lotus. These are ancient cultural icons rebranded to represent new faiths. They existed before the religions that use them now. The halo around saints and deities, borrowed from pre-Christian sun symbolism. The idea of paradise, older than any Abrahamic text. Religion doesn't create meaning out of nothing. It recycles what already exists in human imagination. And the human element isn't just in the institutions, it's in the contradictions believers live with. A supposedly perfect God who allows endless suffering. Holy texts filled with both compassion and cruelty. Commands to love your neighbor, followed by verses demanding violence against unbelievers. When humans write moral codes, contradictions are inevitable because humans are complex. But when you claim those same words come from an infallible being, those contradictions become impossible to justify, unless you pretend they're mysteries. The more you study religion as a system, the more it looks like an invention designed to solve very human problems. How do you explain the unexplainable? Religion says God did it. How do you maintain order? God commands it. How do you comfort the grieving? They're in a better place. How do you justify power? God chose me. It's elegant, really. Every question has an answer that ends the conversation. And that's the real trick. Once you insert God as the answer, no one's allowed to ask more questions. That's why religion has always feared doubt. Doubt is contagious. It spreads faster than faith. Because once one person starts asking why, others start realizing how flimsy the answers are. Throughout history, those who questioned religion were punished, exiled or killed, not because they offended God, but because they threatened control. And yet, despite that control, despite centuries of dominance, religion is slowly losing its grip. More and more people are realizing that morality, meaning, and wonder don't need a divine source. They can stand on their own. You don't need to believe in a creator to appreciate creation. You don't need scripture to know kindness matters. But before we get there, it's worth asking. If religion was made by humans, how did it become so good at feeling divine? How did something entirely human end up convincing billions that it came from beyond humanity? That's the mystery worth unraveling. So how does something purely human feel so convincingly divine? The answer lies in how our minds work. Religion didn't just shape human thinking shaped religion. It fits perfectly with the shortcuts, fears, and biases built into the brain. Start with pattern seeking. Humans are wired to find meaning, even where none exists. A rustle in the grass could be the wind, or a predator. Our ancestors survived by assuming agency behind every noise. That instinct never went away. Today, when something strange happens, an accident, a coincidence, a dream that comes true, people still feel a hidden hand must be guiding it. Religion takes that impulse and gives it a name: God, fate, destiny. The feeling of someone behind events is natural. The leap to a supernatural someone is the cultural part. Then there's the comfort reflex. When life is painful or uncertain, belief releases anxiety the same way reassurance from a parent does. Studies show that prayer and ritual calm the same stress pathways that activate during fear. It's not evidence of divine presence. It's biochemistry doing what it evolved to do: soothe. The relief feels real because it is real, just doesn't prove the story attached to it. Emotion also overrides reason when it's shared. Group worship amplifies feeling through rhythm, song, and movement. Neuroscientists find that synchronized chanting or singing floods the brain with endorphins and oxytocin, the chemicals of trust and connection. You walk out of a service feeling uplifted, bonded, and convinced something larger was there. But that larger thing is human resonance. You can get the same surge at a concert or a protest. The difference is interpretation. Memory plays a role too. Miracles tend to happen where documentation is weakest. In distant times, remote places, or private experiences, human memory is famously unreliable. It rewrites itself to fit our expectations. When people retell a story of divine intervention, each retelling polishes it. Eventually, myth feels like history because repetition hardens imagination into fact. Religion survives by retelling. Authority seals the illusion. From childhood, most people hear religious claims from trusted adults. When beliefs are introduced early, before skepticism develops, they sink in as emotional truths, not logical ones. Later, when confronted with doubt, the brain defends those beliefs the same way it defends personal identity. To question them feels like tearing out part of yourself. That's why evidence rarely changes minds. Emotion built the foundation long before reason moved in. And there's another bias. Humans hate randomness. We want moral symmetry. The good rewarded, the evil punished. The real world rarely works that way. Religion fixes that imbalance by promising cosmic justice. Maybe injustice wins today, but not forever. There will be heaven, hell, karma, reincarnation. Some system that makes sense of chaos. It's appealing because it satisfies fairness, not because it's factual. These mechanisms don't make believers foolish. They make them human. Everyone craves order and purpose. Religion just offers an all-inclusive package. Rules to live by, a reason to suffer, and a promise that none of it is wasted. It fills existential silence with story. That's also why religion spreads so effectively. Ideas that comfort, inspire, and threaten all at once are contagious. Beliefs promising eternal reward for obedience and eternal punishment for disbelief create a self-protecting meme. Questioning becomes dangerous. Spreading the idea becomes virtuous. It's a feedback loop that defends itself. That's not divine genius. That's cultural evolution doing what it does best, preserving the memes that survive. Once belief takes root, confirmation bias keeps it alive. Every answered prayer becomes proof. Every unanswered one becomes God's mysterious plan. No result can disprove the system. That circular logic is brilliant and entirely human. It's the same trick conspiracy theories use. Any contradiction is reinterpreted as deeper truth. Psychology aside, culture reinforces it. Art, architecture, and ritual give belief tangible form. A massive cathedral or a call to prayer echoing through a city doesn't just remind people of God. It overwhelms the senses. Grandeur equals credibility. If millions kneel in unison, the brain concludes, there must be something real here. Social proof works better than evidence ever could. That's why personal experience feels so decisive. When someone feels peace while praying, they interpret it as contact with the divine. But feelings don't reveal truth. They reveal internal states. Meditation, breathing exercises, and even music can produce identical sensations. The experience is genuine. The explanation is cultural. Religion owns the vocabulary for awe, so awe gets labeled religious by default. And yet, when you strip away the dogma, the human needs underneath remain beautiful. The longing for meaning, the love for community, the drive to understand existence, those are the real sacred things. Religion just claims monopoly on them. It sells what humanity already has. That's the paradox. The very emotions believers take as proof of God are the same emotions that prove how good humans are at creating gods. We build belief from the inside out, then mistake the echo for a voice from beyond. But understanding that doesn't cheapen life. It deepens it. If the awe you feel at the night sky comes from your own brain, that means wonder is part of you, not a gift handed down. It means meaning isn't given, it's made. Still, one question remains. If people built religion out of emotion, story, and need, what happens when those needs change? What does the world look like when faith no longer holds the answers? Let's talk about something that's rarely discussed, honestly. The contradictions within the Bible itself. If the Bible were truly divine, inspired by an all-knowing, all-perfect God, then it should at least be consistent with itself, right? But what we find instead are contradictions. Not hidden, not subtle, but often sitting in plain sight. For example, let's start at the beginning, the creation story. Genesis 1 says God created plants first, then animals, then humans, both male and female in at the same time. But Genesis 2 tells a completely different story. First, God creates a man, then plants, then animals, and only later, after Adam fails to find a companion, God creates a woman from his rib. 2 creation orders, 2 narratives, one supposedly perfect book, and it doesn't stop there. How did Judas die? In Matthew, he hangs himself. In Acts, his body bursts open in a field. So which is it? Or take the resurrection story, the event Christianity is built on. In one gospel, the women see one angel. In another, 2. In one, they run and tell the disciples. In another, they say nothing because they're afraid. The details don't line up, and when you try to merge them, the story falls apart. If a police report had this many contradictions, no one would believe it. But when it comes to the Bible, people call it mystery or divine interpretation. And here's the real question. If this book was supposedly guided by God, why would it contain human errors, editing differences, and historical inaccuracies? Wouldn't a divine message be at least factually consistent? It's almost as if the Bible wasn't written by one perfect mind, but by many imperfect ones, each trying to explain the world as they saw it. And when people noticed the contradictions centuries later, the church didn't fix them. They told people not to question them, because the moment you start asking questions, the illusion starts to crumble. There's a quiet revolution that's been unfolding for centuries, a shift in how humans see the world and their place in it. And this shift tells us more about religion's human origin than any ancient text ever could, because as knowledge grew, belief began to shrink. Not out of arrogance, but out of understanding. Every discovery, every insight, every new question answered by evidence, chipped away at the foundations once held up by faith. When we learned what causes disease, prayers for healing lost some of their power. When we understood the movements of the planets, astrology and divine intervention lost their grip. When we discovered evolution, the old stories of creation became too small to contain reality. What was once seen as the work of invisible gods turned out to be the work of nature, predictable, measurable, explainable. And that's when the truth became harder to ignore. Religion wasn't made by gods reaching down to us. It was made by humans reaching up to something they didn't yet understand. The more we discovered, the clearer it became that religion was never about knowledge. It was about comfort. It was our earliest attempt at control, at safety, at order in a chaotic world. We wrote rules, built rituals, and told stories to make sense of existence. We called it divine, but it was deeply human. As societies advanced, the cracks started to show. People began noticing how religions adapted to fit new eras, how beliefs evolved, not through revelation, but through revision. When old dogmas couldn't stand against reason, they quietly changed form. When moral codes no longer fit, new interpretations appeared, as if truth itself could be updated like a law. That adaptability isn't a sign of divine perfection. It's a sign of human editing, a reflection of our ability to repackage old ideas to fit new times. If religion were truly divine, it wouldn't need to keep adjusting to survive. It would simply be unchanging, undeniable, and self-evident. But it's not. It bends, it shifts, it negotiates, because it's built on the same fragile foundation as every other human invention, belief. And today, as science fills the gaps and secular ethics take hold, religion's influence is fading, not because people have become wicked or lost their spiritual side, but because we've outgrown the myths that once guided us. Morality didn't disappear when faith began to crumble. If anything, it became stronger. rooted in empathy and shared experience, in the understanding that doing good doesn't need divine approval. That's what the decline of religion reveals. It was never divine. It was always human, a reflection of our fears, our hopes, and our imagination trying to make sense of a universe that owes us nothing. And maybe that's not something to mourn, but something to respect, because it means we made it. We built meaning from nothing, and now we're learning to rebuild it on truth. The gods may have faded, but humanity didn't vanish with them. We simply stepped out of their shadows and started writing our own story. If religion was made by humans, not God, then the question becomes, what happens after we finally admit that? What fills the space left behind when faith fades? For some, that moment feels terrifying, like stepping off a cliff into uncertainty. Religion offered simple answers, clear rules, and eternal promises. Without it, the world can feel too big, too cold, too indifferent. But that fear doesn't mean there's nothing beyond it. It means we're finally looking at reality without filters. When we stop believing that meaning comes from above, we start realizing it comes from within. Meaning isn't handed down. It's built, shared, discovered, and redefined through living. And that's far more powerful than anything promised by religion. The beauty of a sunset doesn't fade because it's not a sign from heaven. It's beautiful because we understand it. Because photons, atmosphere, and the tilt of the earth combine to paint light across the sky. Knowing the science doesn't kill the wonder. It deepens it. The same applies to life itself. We don't need a divine author to find purpose. Purpose grows from the choices we make, the people we love, the work we do, and the legacy we leave. Religion once claimed to own that, but purpose has always belonged to us. Morality, too, doesn't vanish without God. It matures. It stops being about obedience and becomes about empathy. It's no longer about what's sinful, but what's harmful. Not about what pleases a deity, but what helps another person suffer less. That shift, from fear to compassion, is what makes us more human, not less. The most moral societies in the world today are often the least religious, not because they lack belief, but because they've learned to rely on reason, cooperation, and shared humanity instead of divine authority. They've shown that kindness doesn't need commandments, and justice doesn't need judgment. When you look at how far we've come, from tribal gods of thunder to quantum physics, from holy wars to international law, you start to see a pattern. The story of humanity isn't the story of divine revelation. It's the story of progress. Slow, messy, imperfect progress. Driven not by faith but by curiosity, doubt, and courage. And maybe that's what religion was all along. A first draft of understanding. A mythic attempt to explain everything before we had the tools to explore it. It was a placeholder, a human placeholder, until we could stand on our own. Now we can. We've reached a point in history where we no longer need gods to make us good, or sacred texts to tell us what's true. We can see the universe for what it really is, vast, ancient, indifferent, and still find awe in it. Not because someone made it for us, but because we exist within it, against all odds. There's something profoundly moving about that out of all the random collisions of matter and time, consciousness arose. Us, small creatures, aware of our own existence, capable of love, of art, of reason. We made stories about gods because we didn't understand ourselves. Now we do. At least a little more. And that understanding is sacred in its own way, not because it's divine, but because it's real. So when someone says, without God, life has no meaning, maybe the truth is the opposite. Without us, the universe has no meaning. We are the meaning makers. We are the storytellers. We are the creators, not of worlds, but of wonder. And maybe that's enough. Maybe it always was.